Well, thank you all for being here. I hope you all are having a great summit so far. You have made it to Friday afternoon. And so after lunch, no less, on a beautiful day in the midst of Jazz Fest. So I know if you have chosen to be in this room, you are a diehard solar advocate. So I'm looking forward to some lively Q&A when we get to that portion of the programming. Just a few quick announcements and housekeeping before we get into things. This session is approved for both continuing legal education as well as continuing education credit for planners, landscape architects, and lead professionals. There is a continuing education table in the lobby located adjacent to the registration desk, so you can pick your forms up there, you self-report, and you can return them back there as well. Also, a special thank you to our session sponsor, Plexus Group, and all of the summit sponsors who are listed in your program and in the slideshow during the session. The summit would not be possible without their support. So again, thank you. If you are affiliated with one of those groups, we truly appreciate all of your help and support being here. Another bit of a programming note, in your program, Logan Burke was listed as a speaker. Unfortunately, she is ill and not able to join us today. So we wish her a speedy recovery, but we have managed to pivot a bit with our panel and cover that content, and so we'll still be having a conversation about microgrids as well. Just to tee this up, CPEX has been looking and thinking and learning about solar over the last several years. We dug into land use regulations recently and put together a toolkit that is now available for communities throughout Louisiana to really look at sort of the planning questions and dialogue around solar as it relates to integrating it into your set of local land use regulations, and it provides a bit of a framework for those activities. And so I highly recommend you all checking that out if it's something you're interested in, and we're happy to answer any questions regarding that if you have any. And so let me now introduce our speakers. Jeff Canton is the founder and president of Solar Alternatives. It's a design-build firm specializing in clean energy development. It's recognized as a leader in microgrid technology, electric vehicle infrastructure, and solar energy systems. A bit of trivia I just learned earlier. The car chargers actually outside this building, Jeff was involved in getting those put in, so courtesy of him. Canton's firm has completed over 2,000 regional projects. Additionally, Canton co-founded the Regional Solar Trade Association and has provided testimony for the past 12 years at state commissions and local councils advocating for clean energy initiatives. We are also joined by the Honorable Devonte Lewis. Devonte was elected in 2022 to serve as the Public Service Commissioner for Louisiana's 3rd District. He's representing constituents from 10 Louisiana parishes, including the Baton Rouge and New Orleans greater metropolitan areas. Devonte serves as the co-chair of the Outreach and Campaigns Advisory Committee for the State Priorities Partnership, a network of state advocacy organizations advancing policies that benefit people with low income, and was elected the chair of SPP's steering committee. And so please offer a warm welcome to both our speakers today. I'm excited to have you all here. And now Jeff.
All right, thank you everyone. Thanks to CPEX for the invite. This is a very unique event. I kind of wish we had more of these, because a lot of what our challenges are in Louisiana in particular is just around recognizing what the opportunity is, what the technology is, how it fits in. When you're in East Coast, West Coast state, you see a lot of this technology. You see it on the buildings, you see it in the news, you see it in the schools and in the discussion. So we spend a lot of our time both as a company and the trade association just in educating, so I feel like we're always catching up. It's kind of like remedial classes in some sense across the state with policymakers and all that. So anything that this group can do and the broader advocates and businesses to raise awareness of solar, microgrids, community solar, all the buzzwords that are out there, and just how it really directly impacts us. This is a huge influence on whether you see this stuff come off the slides and end up on buildings. Our experience is that it takes more than one contact with a lot of organizations for them to take this seriously to where they go for funding, or they actually decide they're going to implement it. So thank you for being here. It is a big step. I've taken on a little bit of what Logan was going to do. My background, my company actually does a lot in microgrids, so I'm going to be happy to talk to you all about microgrids and answer any questions later on after Devante speaks. So I'll talk a little bit about the technology and just show a couple case studies. Some of you may be familiar with both of these. These are very popular buzzwords, but in reality, once these hit the ground, they take a very concrete form. And just to touch real quick on solar alternatives again, we've been around for 16 years, so we're not a new player in Louisiana. We're not a new face here, even though our profile is a little bit different now. We're called design build, so typically an organization or an entity will come to us and ask for help with a problem. We'll help them with some conceptual engineering, turn that into a hard quote or bid or estimate or proposal. And then they'll find funding and then execute with us, and we'll actually bring the teams in or subcontract to get it built. So we're a fairly turnkey operation that can also provide maintenance after the fact, and that's for solar energy, energy storage, microgrids, which is a combination of technologies, and then electric vehicle infrastructure. So these actually fit all together. They're not really separate technologies. They're more in the energy generation, storage, distribution, and applications. So we're excited because most of us are engineers, or a lot of us are engineers, and we love playing with technology. And the more challenges you guys give us, the more interesting it gets. So microgrids, the phrase, again, it's been kind of abused over the years, but in reality, microgrids are a combination of generation, storage, and isolation technologies that allow either a facility or an entity, like an area, to become separate from what we would call the traditional grid, right? To be able to operate with some independence from a traditional grid. The traditional grid, what are we referring to? We're referring to the model that we've had. If you ignore all the local generation at all of our homes and businesses, the traditional grid is 200 miles away. There's a big plant making lots of electricity, and it goes through, smaller and smaller wires until it gets to your house or your business, and that's what you are actually powering on, is the electrons generated far away. So it goes through different processes in there, right? It's an amazing system. I mean, it's probably one of the most complex systems in the world, is the American power grid. And, and its reliability speaks to, our ability as Americans to solve pretty interesting problems and create a reliable system around it. So traditional grid, you generate, you transmit, you distribute, and you use through a very linear process from one end to another. There's nothing wrong with this system if you look at it from the terms of if everything works perfectly, nothing ever goes wrong. And your supply, you could have a very cheap generation method out there that gives you nice cheap energy. And in our area, we understand that that's all those little wires in between where that's made and where that gets to. There's a lot of vulnerability there, And so I think we're recognizing more and more as the changing climate creates a changing weather patterns and more influence on our on this grid, and points out the vulnerabilities of it, that model might need to be tweaked a little bit. You're not going to ever move completely away from this model unless we do something really amazing with pocket fusion systems or something. But what can we do to make the overall picture for that end user or that end community more reliable, especially if it's a situation where they really need that reliability, or if we can do it in a way where it actually helps make things more reliable and cheaper at the same time. So a microgrid is made up of the traditional grid that's not separate from the microgrid. It's part of it because it's one of the inputs of power. But it's also made up of other sources, right? You could have a generator, just a regular gas generator. And you could have a solar energy system, a wind energy system. You could have fuel cells. You could have, the most recent thing, I got a Ford Lightning recently, and apparently you can put a little gadget on the building that lets us plug it in and run the building off the battery inside of the Ford Lightning, So we're actually going to do that as a lab experiment on our own building. So that makes it even another element to the microgrid. all the sources of power that you can bring into that system, right? And it's important you have to have a load. I mean, a microgrid is not just the generation by itself. You have to have something that's going to use that power, or the sources aren't going to, you can't turn them on without somewhere for that energy to go. And energy storage is a critical part of microgrids as well, right? So generating all this energy, a lot of these sources are fluctuating, right? Renewable energy is up and down. You don't really want your gas generator to burn fuel all the time, so you really only want to turn it on when you need it. So you have to have a buffer. You have to have something like a big reservoir of energy that you can draw from, and that's what energy storage provides. So the most common format of a microgrid is energy storage, renewable energy, often a dispatchable source, which means something you can turn on and off when you need to, like a generator, and then the traditional utility grid. Most of the microgrids out there, unless you're very isolated, which there are remote off-grid, off-traditional grid microgrids, are going to have all these inputs. And the magic happens right in the middle. In this case, they're not actually providing power through that controller, but they're signaled. They're told to turn on and off and how to move their energy in and out, and open and close certain valves, essentially, like switches, based on what that controller tells them to do. And that controller knows because it's watching the load. It's saying, how much energy do I need to be providing at this moment to power whatever the load is? The load could be one device. It could be a building. It could be an area microgrid, which we'll talk about in a minute, which is several blocks, right? Or a section of the grid, really, the traditional grid. And in those, in that controller is what decides how much energy, how much battery do I have left in my reservoir? How much fuel is in my generator tank? How much solar am I getting right now? How big are my loads, and are they going up and down? What's happening with the utility grid? Is it on? Is it unstable? Is it off? It makes a decision for you, and it's going to prioritize whatever you tell it to. Fuel reserves or reliability, or minimizing the amount of use of the grid because you maximize your renewable energy. It becomes your advocate, in the energy space. It's going to follow whatever you tell it to do. And so it takes us from relying 100% on a resource that we really don't have a lot of control over, which is the traditional grid, to something where we have complete control over it, and it's just a matter of how much redundancy and reliability you want to build into the system. So these are the elements of a microgrid, right? But what is the load that where's that energy going to go? What are we going to power with it? We could power a whole area, right? In this case, just as an example system, it's an industrial park in California, and it was a specific industrial park, and they had a specific utility feeder coming into it, and they realized, everybody on this section of the grid really wants more reliable power. We're going to section off this part of the grid and put a switch in there where if the grid becomes unstable, we can actually isolate from it, provide our own power, energy storage, renewable energy, and you can see the wind turbines in this image, and we're going to provide our own power from that. The one important element, and this system has been in place for a few years, but one important element of a microgrid as well is, what if your fuel resources are getting lower, the sun's not out, and the traditional grid is down? You may not either be able to or want to provide full power to everything that's trying to take power from you, right? You may want to be able to save some of that energy for the most critical applications, right? So if you're a hospital, you might want to save some of that energy for, the critical care units or the lights, right? Or the climate system or something. So load management becomes a very critical element of a microgrid. And in an area microgrid, it's a challenge, right? Because you're basically having to tell your off-takers. But in this case, just to finish out the idea of the area microgrid, it's not just one building with one set of circuits and off-takers, I want to call it, but loads within the building. It's multiple buildings. It's multiple tenants. It's multiple facilities, and could be over multiple acres or miles, right, that you choose to do this. The bigger the system, the more power you have to be able to provide at one time, the more variability you're going to see in there. And so the planning becomes very critical. You have to know exactly how much that area is going to actually use for energy. So you can't just slap a microgrid on there and say we've I'm going to throw one of these on and it'll work fine. It takes a lot of data, takes a lot of planning. You have to work with every off-taker, get them to recognize they're going to have to do either manual or automatic load management when they're in a microgrid situation. But this area microgrid can also, as much as it can help them have more reliability if their grid becomes unstable, they can also choose to minimize the amount of energy maybe that they use from the grid. Maybe it's cheaper for them to generate their own renewable energy and they want to store it up when they have it, and they want to use it up like at nighttime or something when they would otherwise have to draw from the power grid. So they could actually reduce their own energy needs by using that renewable energy within that microgrid. And that depends, at some point, especially when you're in an area microgrid, if you don't own those wires, you have to have a relationship with the utility to say, this is how we're going to move energy in and out of your grid, utility company, won't name names. But in this case, Concentric Power had a plan with that industrial part to make an arrangement with that utility on those lines. You actually will see if it's a big campus like this, especially with one original owner, they'll just buy all the wires. So you could, if you're a neighborhood subdivision, you could conceptually own the wires in your neighborhood that distribute energy and have one master connection to the utility and truly be your own microgrid, micro-utility. And at some point, you run into regulatory rules you've got to follow with the state. But that's the concept of an area microgrid, right? Lots of businesses, lots of buildings, different, negotiation and relationship between them, but it's the same elements: a battery, a generation system or multiple systems, a traditional grid, and then managing the loads that come there. A facility microgrid is this kind of scaled down version of the same thing. They can still be quite big, and we're going to talk about one of them in a minute. But a facility microgrid is typically either one building or a couple buildings or like a campus, something that's very compact. It's probably the same owners or the same operators in there, and you're really working with one off-taker, one group that's going to take that energy and will manage their use of the energy. And in most cases, you're going to see it be one meter on the utility grid. And everything in that case can happen behind the meter, right? In the sense that your regulatory rules are very different, right? We're not operating on utility lines. We're not trying to cut off what they call medium voltage, high voltage wires. We're behind that meter. And so your energy generation, your energy storage, your alternate systems are all going to look much more familiar, right? Solar panels on a building rooftop, generator behind the building, transfer switch, right next to the meter. Those are, at some point, you add those elements up together and you have a microgrid. I call it a microgrid, but if you ever go to somebody's house and they've got a battery there and they happen to have a generator too, they got a microgrid. Now, using it and treating it like a microgrid and programming it to do what you want it to do is really where the magic kind of happens in a microgrid, because it can have more than one function. The one we're going to talk about, and it's a different one we're going to talk about in a minute, but several years ago, there was a new project being contemplated in downtown New Orleans or mid-city New Orleans. The SBP, the recovery organization, had a building that they were going to put up to do low income and veteran housing. And they were really determined to try to make it a net zero building. So the net amount of energy that it used from the grid and generated on its own would net out to zero at the end of the year. So they really went into planning there, a lot of efficiency work into the building, but they said, we want to be able to put in these panels. We really want it to be able to run when the grid's out, because the grid's always going out. In mid-city, that particular part of the grid was always having problems. So they said, can we do net zero and can we do a microgrid at the same time? And that system got funded, it got built, and during Hurricane Ida, that system came online and actually kept that building going for weeks until the power came back on. I think it was like 2 or 3 weeks or so before the power came on stably back in that area. And I won't say it wasn't without a couple of on-site visits and a little bit of drama in there, but because you have 50 tenants within that building, it was interesting to get them to understand load management. But that was an active microgrid, and it helped that facility really keep operating when the grid was out. But they also learned over time that load management was a critical part of that. The lesson we learned from that facility also is that your system, besides the off-takers, whoever's going to actually use that energy in the building, really needs to be programmed to prioritize what you want. And in their case, the backup power was a priority for them, but they also have what's called demand charges. And so that battery can be turned on to reduce the peak. During the course of a day, your load varies a lot. And when you peak on it, if anybody ever has looked at a commercial utility bill, you'll have what's called a demand charge, and that will influence your utility bill. You can moderate that with a battery as well. So the microgrid has a purpose beyond just the backup power and environmental aspects. You can actually reduce specific charges as well. So quick look at another microgrid, Crescent Care. This is a health clinic in the central part of New Orleans, kind of towards Fort McMarigny. About 160 kW PV, 220 kilowatt hours, 480 volt system, industrial grade. They had a generator on site, so that got incorporated into it. But that is a self-sufficient facility. They lost $1.5 million in, pharmaceuticals, I guess, when Ida hit. And so because their generator had some issues, they didn't have any way to have a more, another generation source there. So they said 1.5 million, we could basically pay for the system over with that. So that was funded by some national grants, but that was an amazing system that actually worked and is working in practice now for them. Running a little low on time, so I'm going to breeze through community solar. Community solar is happening in a lot of places. You can see the dead zones here are like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and a couple other states. So we're not at the forefront of community solar. But New Orleans does have a good program. It did pass. And what does community solar do for you? It lets anybody who cannot put solar on their own building be able to subscribe, just like you would subscribe to anything. But you're basically renting a piece of a solar farm. And you get the benefits from that. They'll vary a little bit by month. And you'll work with a provider to get the benefits of that. And a developer knows that if they come into a community, the rules are set up for them to be able to run a business, but be able to provide the services in a reliable way. And the share that you get, you can either buy it, you can rent it for a certain number of time. The most common model, and the model that's in New Orleans, is going to be more of a subscription model. You pay a little bit every month or every year, and you get the benefits from that. And the model is that you would save a little bit every month based on what you pay relative to your utility bill. There aren't any examples in Louisiana, but in Maryland, there's a really good program as part of a pilot program. A lot of 2 and 3 megawatt systems, so that's like about 4,000 or 5,000 solar panels you can imagine out in the field. It was part of a pilot program, and for them, the manager is Clean Choice Energy, and it also doubled as what they call a pollinator habitat, which sounds to me just like wildflowers, but it's it's a functioning system. There's hundreds of these around the country. There's 7.5 gigawatts, I believe 7.3 gigawatts right now. But I'm happy to answer some questions on all that later, but a lot of good information out there. I would say community solar is a learning process. There is a good opportunity in New Orleans, so if anybody's got an interest in developing these things, there's a chance right now. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. That was really great. And I guess I get the boring job of now being the government official to talk about how we actually make all that work, right? So that's why you won't see any slides, because a lot of what I'm talking about is the process and how we can do this in Louisiana, make it easier and better, and then also bring microgrids, community solar. But what are those challenges that we actually are facing to put this on the grid and make it more reliable? So I'm going to kind of step back for a second and just kind of give you some of the lay of the land. I mean, when you think about our interest in renewable energy in Louisiana, we are one of 14 states that do not have what we call a renewable portfolio standard, which is a plan to diversify our generation mix using renewable energy. And so without that, it makes it very hard for us to figure out how we're going to accomplish our goal of getting to 100% clean energy by 2035, and then also net zero by 2050. And so when you think about all of the energy produced in the state of Louisiana, only 3% of our entire grid right now is using renewable energy. And so even if we just set a very unambitious goal for renewable energy in Louisiana, we probably could make a significant difference just right off that alone. And that really starts, I think, with solar. And so how do we do this? I mean, I think we have to start talking about an energy plan for Louisiana. One of the things that is really going to challenge our push for solar in this state is going to be the industrial load growth that we are seeing from the economic development or the industrial renaissance that you may hear about. And so I want everybody to think about this. When you think about all of the energy used in Louisiana, 60% of it comes from those big industrial plants, which is wildly out of pocket with most other states, right? Where us as individuals are only consuming about 40% of all of the cost of energy in this state. And so that is going to put significant pressure on us to do something very different. And why we have to talk about solar, and I think microgrids, as Jeff was talking about, is extremely important, because what's going to happen, let's back up. We probably need about 1,000 gigawatts to handle all of the growth that is coming from these new industrial players. These are going to be from AI, data centers, new facilities. To meet that demand, as we were talking about, it's going to require us to produce more energy. And what's going to happen and why we have to start talking about easing some of those barriers that Jeff was talking about, because when you think about it, we are going to be rushing to get this economic development. I mean, if you look at the data centers that have just been announced in rural Mississippi, unlike other industrial plants or users, they are agnostic to where they live. They're not necessarily taking into account other economic development factors such as schools, economic structure. They are looking for who can provide the power for me and who can give it to me. And so if we are not forefront with, I think, solar from a regulatory standpoint, we really threaten our environment, because now what we're going to happen is what we're going to see is the utilities are going to say, I don't have time to really think about solar. I'm going to double down. I can build a gas generator in 3 years. It can provide 500 megawatts worth of power. Let's go. They're going to come to us and say, hey, look, commission, you see this growth coming. We want this data center in Louisiana. Let's not think about anything else. And so that's why I think really looking at this is important, and why the utility business is actually the most important to solar. We talk a lot about community solar, we talk a lot about residential solar, but I really think the most important thing we need to be talking about is industrial renewables, because that is what's going to actually build more renewables in this state, because they are the biggest users. So some of the things that we are looking at the commission really is what we call these purchase power agreements for industrial users, which would allow them to buy their own renewable power, cutting out the middleman of the utility, and then feeding the excess of that renewable energy back to the grid to benefit us. And so if we really start there and easing up some of these regulatory burdens, we are going to incentivize more and more solar to come into this state. One of the challenges, and I think Jeff will tell you this as a developer, is the regulatory process, either at the local level or at the state level. So, I mean, one of the biggest factors that I think we all have to talk about, especially in your local communities, is local permitting. This is the driver that is either going to stop or accelerate solar in the state of Louisiana, because what we are seeing now is the anti-renewable fleet, which I think sometimes conflates oil and gas generation, which are technically two different things, but people see and kind of conflate oil and gas with the gas generator, is that we're going to see the changes in local permitting. So for example, Entergy had announced about 300 megawatts of solar that they were going to put in St. James Parish, and they were going to build it. However, the St. James Parish Police Jury put a moratorium on solar development. They have now lifted that moratorium, but the regulatory rules on permitting that they have done basically means this project of 300 megawatts of solar that was supposed to come on in 2025 now most likely won't come on until 2028 at the earliest, and probably is going to be even smaller. And so one of the things that we have to do better is really be communicating with local offices about the economic development of solar, but also what does it mean for the grid? What does it mean for our reliability? What does it mean for affordability? I think the slide that Jeff showed about powering back to behind the meter is extremely important. So when you think about it, I'll step back for a second, and you think about your rate design, and you look at that demand charge, the way that the commission does this, which I don't like, is we make the demand rate by what we call peak demand. So we're going to look at that time of day when the most energy is being consumed, and then we allocate the rate accordingly. So when you think about it, our peak demand's typically somewhere, let's just say about 6:30, because that's when you're at home, all your lights are on, your AC is blowing, the washing machine is going, the gas stove is on. So who pays the higher price based off of that structure is residentials. Because at that 6:30 level, the industrial users, your Exxon, your ConocoPhillips, your Shell, they're not hitting peak demand because they're kind of a stagnant producer. And so if we are not kind of utilizing microgrids behind the meter, then we're not going to incentivize solar for you because it's not going to be beneficial. Because the way that we developed your rate was solely based off of who is using most of the demand at the top at our peak hour. And so that is one of the challenges that we're facing with adding more renewable energy, particularly solar, is the way that the utility business is structured, because we are structured in a way that de-incentivizes it. So how are we combating kind of that? Well, as you can see now, most of the utilities are recognizing that these industrial users really want renewable energy. This is because of their ESG goals. This is because that's what their shareholders want, their own sustainability requirements. And so the utilities are now offering their own solar. Entergy has right before the commission now 3,000 megawatts of solar that they are putting on to the grid. But here's the catch-22 why we have to do more, is because majority of that now will be rate-based to residentials, but all the benefits would go to the industrial user. And so how then do we not create this false dichotomy where people are going to look and say, you're building all this renewable energy, but my bill is going up. Why should we do it go back to gas? And so it's these type of barriers that we're facing in the regulatory system that I think makes it extremely complex and hard to do, but we are doing it in the most efficient way. I would say one of the most important things that I've been looking at to combat is really how we talk about the livelihood of solar and agriculture, because that's going to be the biggest push that we are seeing. How do we do this? And so there is this growing study and phenomenon of agrovoltaics, which is the study of how crops and energy live together. And this is a place where I think Louisiana can lean in. How can we grow sugarcane around a solar panel, right? How can we incentivize that when you are in Ascension Parish or St. James, that you're not talking about this divide? So one of the things that I've learned talking with our agriculture community is when you think about sugarcane land, for example, 75% of the sugarcane land that is being used is leased. It's not owned by the sugarcane farmers. And so what does that create? It creates a complete divide, because now if you're an agriculture or you're a farmer, you are now trying to compete with a solar developer, which is why you're seeing the backlash from communities passing permitting restrictions, because they're saying, wait a minute, I can't as a local farmer compete with a California-based solar company that wants 3 acres to put a community solar field right there. And so these are some of the barriers of the great technology that we are seeing around microgrids that are improving, but we have to be cognizant about from not only our state legislature, but from our local governments, because if they hamstring us, the regulatory process can't work. I can't force a utility to build more renewable energy, and then all of the land that they want to build on, the local government is saying you can't use it. And so this is why the collaboration of city planning and conversations between local, state, regulatory, and developers matter, because as I push utilities to invest more in solar, if my community is making it harder for them to develop, we don't have that. And what's going to happen, as this growth comes, we're going to hit that peak demand. And what's going to be our only option? Rolling blackouts or gas generation. And so it is the complexity of the system that I think we have to work on. And so how are we going to do better? So what I've really tried to do is we have what's called these integrated resource plans. These are these 20-year outlooks that the utility companies develop and put before the commission. And as I mentioned, majority of the time, it doesn't include microgrids, it doesn't include community solar, it doesn't include net metering, for example. I mean, when you think about our net metering policy in Louisiana, it is one of the weakest incentives for rooftop solar. When you think about Entergy Louisiana, only 1% of its customer base is using solar right now. And so we have to think about how we incentivize more rooftop solar and community solar at the exact same scale if we want to integrate the grid, if we want to bring these investments back into the state of Louisiana. And so what I think we have to do is really look at how we are utilizing these energy sources and what do they matter and mean for the development and the growth of the state. And so community solar and commercial solar, I think, are the two most important places that we should start. Not saying rooftop solar is not important, but as we all know, Louisiana, we are an extremely poor state. With a weak incentive from the utility company, even if we make the utility company have a better incentive program, without a state tax incentive or even a tax rebate for rooftop solar, it's not going to reach the amount of people that we want it to reach, which is why investments in community solar makes more sense for the state right now, because then we can have people incentivizing to continue to build, which means now we are socializing that policy and that risk. And so if we really want to kind of like open up and think about where we are, we have to strategize with all of the federal dollars that are coming. So, I mean, many of you may have seen that Louisiana is going to receive around $147 million for our Solar for Y'all program. We still have significant incentives coming down the pipeline from the home energy rebates, and I'm encouraged that the state of Louisiana will apply and write an application. And what this program will do is it will allow rebates and incentives for residential customers. So when we talk about upgrading appliances to be more energy efficient, you can get an 80% rebate match. And so when we match this federal investment with regulation, with permitting, then we can start to really drive home making that energy plan, as we talked about earlier, to diversify the generation mix. But I think my biggest fear is that we are on a time war. We really do not have the time to sit around and wait. Because as I said, the industrial growth is going to jeopardize this conversation today if we are not more proactive on changing regulatory barriers and changing the incentivization of solar into our communities. We've recognized that they can be resiliency hubs, right? We've seen what battery storage can do and how that can help curb peak demand. And one of the things I think we have to do is also put in newer technology to incentivize solar and incentivize renewables. And so what do I mean by new technology? I'm talking about distributive energy resources. These aggregators are the unlocked potential that we have. And so many of you may have seen about having like a smart thermostat. And if we just did this, I just want everyone to think about this. If we, all of us in this room, probably about another 100 people, enacted a smart thermostat and allowed our utility company at peak demand to adjust our thermostat by 1 degree, it would shave off about 6 megawatts worth of energy being used. And so when we are talking about this industrial growth, we have to think about some of these incentivizations to incentivize the other growth in renewable energy, to say like, no, you don't need that gas. Because I think, as Jeff talked about and pointed out, one of the threats is that solar is not a dispatchable generator. You can't just turn it on like a gas generator when you're hitting peak demand and you need load capacity. you have to build that in storage or in batteries. And so how can we incentivize the utility to say like, no, we're also going to be reducing our energy usage and consumption at the same time, so you need less dispatchable generation? Because that's going to be the argumentation that you're going to start to hear, and you're seeing it. I mean, you look at North Carolina and you can look at Duke Energy, where they are just tripling down on gas generation right now, saying, well, because we just can't afford to risk reliability with solar, even though we know that it exists. So that's why emerging technology has to be part of the conversation in solar, because if you're not talking about time of use, if you're not talking about adjustments and not using your appliances at certain hours of the day, you are increasing the demand. Because I want to kind of talk about the paradox as I conclude of what we really face. So we are in an electrification mode, right? Everyone wants to electrify. We're electrifying our fleet of cars. We're electrifying our appliances. We are making our homes more efficient with heat pumps. But all that does is create a demand for more energy. And so if we are talking electrification at the same time we're talking about renewable energy, but not talking about the resources that reduces that demand, we are inadvertently telling the utility company, build more gas, don't invest in solar because it's not useful to where the growth of the state and the growth of homes are going. And so that's why I did kind of have slides, because it's hard to contextualize that in a slideshow. And I think the only thing I could do is put like somebody screaming, because that's what I'm doing right now, is how all of these policies interact and how some things we're not thinking about are going to hinder our push for renewable energy if we do not do this smart, if we do not do this in a just way. Because what we're going to do is we're incentivizing on one end, but we're also making the case why we shouldn't invest in it on the other end. And that's the challenge that we're going to face with solar, and that's the opportunity to build a more resilient community, because we know if we look at the blackouts in Texas, everyone's going to tell you that was about the market. It wasn't. What happened in Texas during Winter Storm Uri was they were using so much dispatchable generation, the gas pipes froze. And so the blackout came not from their relying on renewable energy, but because they didn't have capacity, because everything was dispatchable. And so what we have to think about now is, how do we use those lessons to invest, but to make the case of how all of these energy resources go together. And solar is the most important thing for Louisiana. We have the land, we have the opportunity, we have the infrastructure, but what we cannot do is let economic development and our future harm our clean energy future. And that's the fear that I have. Thank you. I look forward to talking to you more.
Great. Thank y'all both for your presentations. It's left me with a lot to think about, and we're going to open things up to questions. But while we're getting the first question, I've got one. Y'all both kind of touched on the hole that we have right now in the community solar space in Louisiana, and we had a workshop earlier this week where we were discussing solar in general, and we talked about community solar almost being kind of like the Goldilocks, right? It's the thing in between, the residential and the big utility scale. And you've touched on, Devonta, you touched on some of what the barriers are, and the challenges we're having. I'm interested to hear from both of y'all what you think some of the pathways might be to address those barriers and to start to open up that as an available opportunity for us in Louisiana.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll just talk. I think one of the biggest opportunities that we face with this is commercial solar as a bridge for community solar. So what I mean by that is, when you look around, there's quite a lot of quite a lot of opportunities to. When we're thinking about community solar, oftentimes we're thinking about a community solar farm in a location within a neighborhood. But where I think the biggest bang for our buck is really utilizing commercial buildings and incentivizing those to be those community solar hubs. Looking in communities where you may have a school or a Walmart or a Target or a building downtown as a way to build that resilient community hub. And so it is kind of an opportunity because if you think about it, we have so much commercial space that most of these rooftops, you're not talking about land acquisition. You're not talking about permitting. You're not talking about whether or not you're 500 feet from the road or the agriculture. You are utilizing unused space. And what you can see that unused space not only can produce the solar, but it also can produce economic development. I think about what I saw a school district in Arkansas basically decided they were going to invest significantly in solar at every one of their schools in that district. And they took what they had been running for the last 3 years, a deficit, into a significant surplus that they gave every teacher a $1,000 raise from the energy savings that they made just from investing in commercial size solar on each one of their schools. And so the reason I think commercial is important is not only because it does provide those resiliency hubs that we can use that access power with a battery storage to keep that community lit up during a storm, but it also provides the economic benefits that then can revitalize the community because now they are now being able to recruit more teachers simply because they invested in solar. And they did it at a commercial scale. And so I think that's the big opportunity while we still try to work through residential, industrial, utilizing commercial as a communal way of solar development.
And I'll riff on that in that there are some amazing opportunities right now in commercial solar, specifically because the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of acronyms going around in the Fed world right now. The IRA introduced some extra incentives for businesses that can add up to 40-50% more of the project cost being covered by federal tax credits, which are also now available to nonprofits. So suddenly those projects are much more well-funded, and the pricing right now for solar equipment is coming down. So like the economics for commercial projects are very strong. So if you're talking about using an existing building, not having to build an array for it, that is really powerful. There's a huge policy side to community solar as well. New Orleans knows this well because they put out a community solar program about 5 years ago, and it was crickets for 3 or 4 years because it was just not well designed. It was not attractive to the developer. It was not attractive to the subscriber. So, at some point, the industry went back, our trade association said, you're going to need to rewrite this if you want anybody to ever touch it and for it to actually work. You can write a program if you don't want it to work, and put it out and it won't work. So but they did want it to work, and they went back and they revised it, and the program is much more reasonable and can offer, the value for both parties. But the programs have to be designed around that. And as everybody might know, New Orleans, Lafayette, some other jurisdictions around the state are regulated separately from the Public Service Commission, so they can set their own rules. The PSC would have to address that separately if it was to happen outside of New Orleans.
Question, great.
Hello. I'd like to drill into the St. James issue more and broaden it out. One of the lines of opposition to the solar farms in St. James, one of them, was that they were using or proposing to use valuable sites with riverfront property for solar farms with minimal economic impact long-term, particularly for jobs. And so their argument was, is this the right opportunity cost decision versus a plant or something else? And I wonder if you could speak to, you're saying that there needs to be opening up of this. How do you balance that consideration? Where do we want to give up these valuable sites for solar versus something else?
No, I think your question is important, and I think that's one of the local challenges that we face with solar development, right? I mean, I'll get directly to your question, but I'm going to use another example. We can look at DIMCO. DIMCO just opened up a 300 megawatt solar facility in Amite. It's the largest PSC jurisdictional approved solar facility now. And that was one of the challenges was about the land use. And so what NextEra, the generator provider, DIMCO, and the parish government of Tangipahoa did was they basically created policies around, for instance, it's pushed off the side of the interstate. They are going to plant some historic trees around it. And so there are some unique ways like that can answer that. But I think to get to your direct question, there is a balance. And I think that's a part of why developers have to be more engaged in the community before you put the project into place, because you want to understand what the community actually values. And I think we have to be open and honest about that, is that if we do not bring community along in the process, they will harm the process. So I always say, if people build it, if you build it, they may come. If they build it, they'll definitely come. So encouraging the community and being a part of that community, understanding what's important to them around the proposed land acquisition is vital, because you don't want to get to the end of the route and then you have significant community opposition. We saw that on the other side of my district in Iberville Parish, where now there was some pushback, and then when NextEra really sat down with the community, we are not seeing those moratoriums like we saw in St. James now in Iberville Parish. And I think it was because they recognized the first step had to be engaging the community, not developing the program. But I think that's the balance that we have to take, is when you understand that, then you can develop your plan accordingly that fits the needs of the community. Now, sometimes it's not going to work. So, I mean, I'm not saying that's a one-size-fits-all solution. There are going to be times it's the needs of the community, the needs of the developer are just not going to match. But that conversation up front may stop some of the hardships later on in getting the project approved.
And if I could add to that right quickly, when we at CPEX initially started working on the toolkit that we produced, we initially kind of billed it as, a model solar ordinance. And we had produced a document that was effectively sort of outlining, here are the things you need to go in and evaluate in your zoning ordinance in order to address, solar development, whether it be at the residential scale or the utility scale in your regulations. What we found out and learned really quickly, that wasn't addressing the problem. The problem was way upstream from that. It was these conversations really that were just kind of basic land use planning conversations. You have these sort of trade-off debates about all kinds of development that might be coming into your community. Is that right for residential development? Do we need to hold this for some kind of commercial or industrial space? And so, we backed up and reformatted how we were approaching the toolkit in order to make space to outline the significance of those conversations and who all needs to be at the table. What are the questions that you should ask in order to kind of help your community evaluate and direct growth in the way that sort of comports with their values and their priorities. And that economic development question, is a key one, agricultural as well. But one thing that we have found through our conversations is a lot of times land that might be attractive for solar development is also probably going to be attractive for other types of economic development just because of the proximity to the infrastructure that's needed to service it. And so that is a very critical piece to this conversation. And I can't echo enough how important it is to have that upstream and have all the voices that are involved, the developers, the policymakers, the community at the table at the same time to navigate that.
Oh, back that, but I do push back on the developers and say, if you're a developer coming into Louisiana, you should not be treating it like you're going into a California county or something. I mean, it's pretty naive of a developer to come into Louisiana and not do stakeholder engagement.
Right.
If they're doing that and expecting things to flow through without having to do the front end work, it's probably a painful learning process for various groups. But I think some groups do it better than others to that degree. They understand they've got a responsibility on the developer side, on the front end, do some of this work and not push on to the PSC or to other groups to do their legwork.
I think we had another question.
Hi, thanks. So my name is Claire Hebert-Morso. I'm from Cameron Parish. I'm also a nationally certified community and economic developer. My question is for Commissioner Lewis. I applaud you for very clearly articulating your approach to all of this, and I don't want to make any assumptions about your four fellow commissioners. I will go ahead and assume that they do not know Nate, Dog, and Warren G. But I don't want to assume this part. Do you feel as though, and I'm not asking you to speak for them, of course, but do you feel as though they share your perspective, and if they don't, that we might be able to convince them. I happen to be one of the 40% of Cameron Parish residents who still do not have transmission post-Hurricane Laura. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Laura hit us August 27th of 2020. How would you feel if you didn't have transmission where you live almost 4 years after a storm? It's unacceptable. So do they share your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a fun question. I'll start with this. I'll say the way I joke with my colleagues is the PSC, we have 3 6-year terms, and we're termed out at 18 years. I have about 17 and a half years left of potential service. And if you froze all of my colleagues right this very second, on my last day of 18 years of service, I would still be the youngest commissioner by 5 years. If you took out one of my commissioners, I would still be the youngest commissioner by 36 years. So I think there are some opportunities, but I do think there is a challenge that the commission itself has not seen its power and the opportunity for us to really be a player in this. I mean, I think the commission over the last decade has gotten into a status of following or just verifying what the utility asks, right? And I think what this moment in this panel, what we're talking about it with microgrids or community solar is, what can we be doing more, right? And I think that's the divide, honestly, is that some of us are reactive, and I'm being like, no, I'm looking, because if we're not paying attention to the changes, right, we end up with that. Like long-term transmission planning should be important. So when I talked about those integrated resource plans, those 20-year plans, Entergy did not include a single paragraph on what they thought they needed to do for transmission for the next 20 years. And so I was the first commissioner since we instituted these planning periods to vote no. And everybody was shocked because no one had ever dared vote no on a planning document. I said, well, I have to, because one of the requirements was tell me about transmission, and you didn't even do that. And so it is that muscle that I think we have to create of accountability. Otherwise, we're going to kind of go in this toy game. But I will say, even if they are not there yet, if you watch our meetings, I kind of force them, because I will do it. I'll pick on your commissioner, my colleague, when we started talking about these integrated resource planning, and I had a binder like I always do of notes. I remember Commissioner Francis took the microphone and says, "Staff, can you tell me, what does IRP stand for?" And he goes, "Oh, it's just for the public's knowledge." And so I was like, well, at least I got him thinking. So I am happy that I did give him a question. So we'll see what the future holds.
This question is for the honorable commissioner as well. I attempt to become a prosumer, not just a consumer, based off of your conversation last night. I'm listening to what I'm hearing are barriers, which includes like a lack of barriers to renewable energy, specifically solar. So I'm hearing those to be a lack of infrastructure, a lack of consumer demand, over-reliance on gas generation, economic demands, and lack of community engagement. Am I missing anything from your talk in terms of what are the barriers that are currently existing?
No, I think that's a good overview. I mean, I think as we think about that prosumer model, and that includes microgrids, as Jeff talked about, it is how do we as consumers then become part of the production of energy, right? Because right now, as I was talking about, we're just consuming it. However, putting battery storage behind the meter, residential solar, at a certain point, we can then be not only using that energy source, but producing that energy source. But that barrier is really kind of those things you talked about, because if I'm not giving you an incentive good enough to put rooftop solar on your home, you're not going to put it on, which means you're not going to produce that extra capacity. And then if you produce that extra capacity, that means I need less of that new buildup. Entergy doesn't need to build a new power plant because now we are not only just consuming all of the energy from them, we are also powering the grid at the exact same time. And so I think it's why all of those have to go together. And one of the reasons why I talk about it in a collaborative barrier way is because we can write an incentive program for residential solar. Without the other mechanisms, it's not going to be successful. I think Jeff's conversation about New Orleans and community solar, the policy can write itself. It's always the enactment. It's always the implementation. And then how do we ensure people are implementing it? And so focusing on that 1A knowledge, but then also requiring not only utilities, but also the other players to be at the forefront is going to be needed to really move us towards that model. I mean, I was in Houston recently at a smart home, and if you've ever seen the new Ford Lightning, I mean, like, it's a generator in its own right. Like this, a Ford truck now can generate the entire house for 7 hours. And so when you think about that, I mean, but the problem is there's still an affordability. I mean, the Ford Lightning costs significantly a lot of money, and to put that charger in your house is going to be, and so that's that balance that I'm talking about, is because if we just push, this technology is only going to hit the top level, right? And that's my fear, is if we're not talking about it in a just way, I'm going to push electrification. Who can afford to go buy an electric stove right now, and an electric, and a high efficient refrigerator, and an electric vehicle? It's going to be affluent people. Right? And then what's going to happen is, because we've electrified, we're going to need more capacity because we don't have low income programs. So then when we build more capacity, then who gets the biggest burden? It's going to be low income people who are now paying more and receiving none of the benefits of the energy usage and energy reduction. And that's why I say all of them have to play together, because you're going to create almost a class warfare if we just kind of keep pushing solar and electrification without talking about the just component of it. Because if I don't have strong low-income programs that actually they can participate in, I'm electrifying my house. I'm getting all the savings because now I have a smart thermostat. I have an electric vehicle. My washer and dryer runs at the appropriate time so my bill doesn't go up. And then who now is suffering from the additional energy burden cost? It's low-income people.
On that real quick, just one slide we didn't slip in. Logan actually had it in hers, but is virtual power plants. Everything what we've been talking about, microgrids, prosumer, the ability to choose your scheduling on when some of this happens. Your virtual power plant is if we tie all these technologies together and give the consumers the ability to opt in, whether it's your thermostat or your electric vehicle charger or your battery system, but letting the grid talk to you and say, hey, can we dial you down a little bit because we got a peaking problem right now. We need to essentially, from the grid's point of view, saving, like reducing load is the same as generating, right? You're creating that, giving them that gap between what they need and what they have. So the virtual power plants are a powerful tool. They're another regulatory, discussion that has to happen. But Texas is really big on these. California, you're seeing these actually come into existence. It's not a hypothetical anymore. So it does give the consumer a lot more power and a role in everything we're talking about.
From a community leadership and city planning perspective, talking about solar, is there any stock in bringing this down to the kind of crowdsourcing level and emphasizing or requiring or incentivizing individual homeowners and developers who are making new neighborhoods to have solar at that level, or is the efficiency not there to impact the whole arena?
I would say it's there. I think that the challenge of the incentivization for residentials has to just be great. I think like the problem why when I talked about 1% of Energy Louisiana's customers are net metering is because not only do they have a lack of an incentive from the utility provider, the state also took away its tax credit. So when you are making that investment, you are now solely now trying to put residential solar on your house with no tax incentive for load reduction. And then the benefit that you get from the utility company is significantly weak. So before we changed our rule in 2017, the commission's policy was it was buy all, save all. I mean, you got net metering. So if, let's say your solar panel produced 1,000 megawatts and you only used 600 megawatts, you got the benefit of the 400 megawatts that you saved, or vice versa. Like if you used 1,000 megawatts and your solar panel produced 600, you only paid Entergy 400. What we did is we switched it to buy all, save all. So now I buy all 600 megawatt, Entergy buys all 600 megawatts from you, and then they just give you a avoided cost of, like, I think right now it's like 7 cents for each megawatt. So you may save, but your savings went from $300 to now 72. And so the challenge, I think, is to incentivize residential, it has to be matched not only with the economics of the development, of the upkeep, maintenance, and management, with the utility incentive, but also the economic incentive if you do not have the disposable income to put up the cost up front. And so I think that's why residential solar hasn't taken off in Louisiana, and also why it's the challenge, and maybe commercial and community is the smarter place to start, because there's a lot more work we have to do to get residential solar up and running at a full rate that it actually would be providing demand curve.
Yeah, and the state changed its rules on solar compensation, like what goes back to grid a few years ago. And so a lot of it is like, what does the grid value what you push to the grid as a consumer? I mean, the energy basically comes out of your wires and goes into your neighbor's house. So it's, I would say the idea of an avoided cost model might be a little bit obsolete. So there are studies done on value of solar for different states, and there was one done in Louisiana years ago that showed a lot more value than is currently being given. That said, incentives always help. Really, if you look at what would be needed to have more solar showing up on the grid, it isn't, I love the tax credit that we had years ago, but it was almost a little bit too much at some point. So you don't need a huge chunk of the cost to get people over the psychological barrier of just doing something different, right? How many people, you don't make your own gasoline for your car. How do you make your own energy for your house, right? So the idea takes a little bit of getting over, but an incentive can help with that. But it's, for a lot of cases, it's a psychological push, almost as much as financial. But I will say the battery technology, the fact that battery and solar technology is getting a little bit more affordable every year, and you have good incentives at that level, and utility rates are generally still climbing, you are getting a little bit closer to intersection points where that leap is not what it used to be. It's a lot lower leap. And the fact that the energy storage gives them the ability to absorb, basically use the energy themselves. They don't have to send it to the grid, right? Because you can fill your battery up in the daytime and use it up at night. Suddenly, you have more control. And the risk to the grid operators is, if we make this so unattractive and the alternative is so affordable, why do I need the grid at all? But we want a grid. It's a great resource. It's a critical part of your microgrid map. But we need to make sure it has its place along with all the other technologies.
But I think there was another question right up here in the front. Tanisha, yeah.
Well, my question was going to be a little different, but on what you just said, it would be for the panel. One problem I had run into in that people were in the residential area rather shocked that all of the solar panel energy went to the energy company, and if everything got wiped out and the grid stopped, you had no option of throwing a switch and running your own house, and that simply stopped the people from wanting to use solar. My question was, and this is for all of you, has there been any type of survey or incentive program? And you talk a lot about developers, but I would imagine there are a lot of very large businesses throughout Louisiana and on major thoroughfares and roads that have very large buildings, that if you talk to those businesses that have existed for a long time, that seemed to be a very untapped resource in order to develop an incentive program for them to put solar panels over a rather extensive warehouse type area. So I was asking, has anyone put together a survey, whether it's Google Earth or whatever, of how many very large buildings with really large roof areas are simply totally untapped to add to a solar grid?
Yeah, I would say not necessarily a survey, but you are seeing the conversations, especially among the bigger commercial users, right? So, I mean, there's two phases. Commercial users kind of get looped in. So you think about like the Manship is a commercial user, but then also Walmart would be a commercial user. You're starting to see the commercial users really recognize that. It is about their rate structure. I mean, I think the challenge for them, and not to get too technical, is normally their rate design because they are part of the demand peak, right? Like, I mean, the commercial users using so much energy, they get squeezed out because when we're developing a rate, the industrial users say, well, hey, look, I'm not really doing all this stuff, so my rate shouldn't be high, and I'm doing all of this. And then you definitely, as a regulator, I can't raise residential too high. So the people that actually get hit the hardest when we are developing utility rates are those very commercial, big warehouse users that you're talking about. And so that's why I've stressed and have been talking, commercial makes the most sense for solar development in Louisiana because they already have the pinch of the higher rates, that the incentivization that we could create to have them lower their rates by their own production of solar and then using either behind the meter or in front of the meter battery storage as a consumption reduction or their own load could be really beneficial. And so I think those conversations are starting. I wouldn't say it's truly developed yet, but that's why I've been primarily focused my energy recently on commercial for that very point that you just made.
You know, and we are on the, I'm forgetting the name of the curve, but you know, we're still in Louisiana. You mentioned we're 3%, right, of our energy is coming from solar right now. So, you know, you're in the early adopter phase, right? And if you look at the way people think about jumping on, whether it's electric cars or induction stoves or new technologies like this, there's a psychological of, I don't want to necessarily, not everybody wants to be the first person in the neighborhood to do it, and businesses are even more conservative about it. So no matter how attractive the program was, I remember, you know, we've been in business for 16 years when the residential tax credit started up. Even though the state was paying a huge chunk and the feds were paying a huge chunk, you couldn't give it away. Nobody wanted to be first, no matter how attractive it was financially. But once it started getting momentum and people suddenly they didn't want to be in on it, they didn't want to be left out of it, right? So I think there's a psychology of that in everything we do, but with businesses even more so because there's a lot of complexities, rate structures, and we do more commercial solar in the state than a lot of groups. And rate structures are very complex. The discussion with the business, if they're using the energy themselves, can involve layers of financing, tax credit eligibility, rate structures, facility usage, you know, specifics about the site itself. So it's as a company, we boil that down into option ABC, but from a business point of view, like I mentioned earlier in the beginning of my talk, it's all about education. It's helping them see that it's not a strange thing to do, that it is happening. It's where Louisiana might be a little bit behind, but the technology is very mature and there. And there are other ways. We're talking about behind the meter, meaning the energy that the facility would use itself. But if we talk about, you know, just picking New Orleans as an example, if you have a community solar program, as Commissioner Lewis mentioned earlier, you can use these buildings as platforms for being a community solar provider. So that commercial business could put solar panels up and then participate in a program where that energy is sold to, you know, its neighbors, right, or the community.
And I think the only thing that I would add as we close out today, I think the kind of analysis you raised would be very interesting to integrate into your community planning process to start to identify, are there locations within your community, whether it be large rooftops or parking lots or other areas where you might be able to tuck in additional community scaled solar or commercial scaled solar, if nothing else to prompt the conversation, to be able to sort of convene those folks and start to talk about, well, what would it take? How feasible is this? You know, and is there an avenue here for us to start to develop more of these co-located, really creative, inventive types of applications of solar that we're starting to see, you know, all over the country. And so with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I think there's a whole lot of interest and dialogue here, so I'm excited to see that. I do have a few programming notes as we close out. Remember, if you are wanting continuing education credit, that is available. So please, you know, see the see the table in the foyer for the appropriate form. Thanks again to our session sponsor, Plexos, and all of the summit sponsors who made all of this possible. This certainly would not happen with their support. I'd like to thank both of our presenters today for their time, expertise, and talent that they lent to us in a very generous way. I'd also like to thank you all for your sort of really deep dive questions and the rich conversation that we were able to have after the fact. So thank you all. Y'all go forth and enjoy your Friday.